Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, November the 25th, 2025, less than 6 months before the big show, the soccer, or what most people call Football World Cup in the United States in June 2026, beginning on June 11th, ending with the final and on July the 19th. It's already quite controversial, the relationship between a certain Donald Trump and Gianni Infantino, the head of FIFA, is causing some controversy, as well as the relationship between Donald Trump and a certain Portuguese football player, Ronaldo. He even got himself photographed in the White House, for better or worse. He was a great player, may not be such a great thinker. This week we're talking about an interesting new book that's come out. It's called The Soccer 100. It's published by The Athletic, and it includes the 100 greatest players in this sport's remarkable history. Players rather than thinkers. My guest today is one of the contributors to this Soccer 100, Amy Lawrence, who's talking to us from Islington in North London. Amy, congratulations on the book. Beautiful book, actually. Thanks so much for sending it to me. We will talk about Ronaldo the footballer, but Ronaldo the politician is another matter. To be a great footballer doesn't mean that you're particularly smart, does it, Amy?
Well, it depends what kind of smart you're talking about. I think there's a big difference between street smarts and kind of authentic philosophical thinking. There are not necessarily that many players who historically have been known for their articulation, for their great thought processes about society and life, the universe, and everything. However, that is a slight it doesn't seem fair to everybody, because there are certainly some players who have gone on to be politicians. For example, there was a famous player, Romario, from Brazil, who went into politics in his native land. There was a great player for AC Milan who came from Georgia in Eastern Europe, who became their president. There was George Weah, who was another fantastic player for the AC Milan team, who was once voted the greatest player in the world back in the 1990s. He became the president of Liberia, his home country. So you can stereotype, but obviously the majority of players, like any great athlete, will find that in their youth, they're angled towards a specific life and upbringing, which focuses on so much training and so much dedication. From these days, even 5-6 years old, the people we might be talking about in 20 years' time, who are the great players of our age, won't be focused on education in their very, very tender youth. The best clubs are now signing players and preparing them and putting into this mini professionalism environment from literally the ages of 5 and 6 years old. So some will pass through their academic careers quite well and be bright as a button, but the majority of them are focused right through their lives, really, on this sport that is engaged the whole world.
Yeah, my question wasn't so much about academic excellence. I mean, as you say, these people spend their lives from a very early age, whether it's formally or informally, playing football rather than studying. It was more perhaps instinct. And it's a funny game, isn't it, Amy? Because you can display remarkable intelligence and agility and foresight on the field. Maradona, of course, comes to mind. And yet one's personal life, and Maradona also comes to mind, there was a wonderful documentary, a series of documentaries about him out 2 or 3 years ago, is the reverse. People have described football as a funny game, but why can you display such remarkable intelligence and artistry on the field, and yet when you're off the field, your life, like Maradona, often is a sort of a tragic unraveled after he went off the football pitch?
I think that's as much to do with the life that they get thrown into and this kind of extreme celebrity. And if you're a top footballer, you become wanted, in demand, pressured, non-stop from the point where you become quite famous, and you have to live in this weird bubble. I think that makes it quite difficult to connect with the real world, and it also makes it very easy. You're obviously pretty handsomely paid if you're a top player, to be having a lot of temptation, a lot of different types of temptation in your life, and I think it takes tremendous discipline to steer clear of them. Someone like Maradona, particularly the era that he was playing, what an unbelievable player he was. He came from a life of abject poverty, really, and was thrust into a world where, in the end, he was being, we can say, looked after, euphemistically, by the Italian mafia.
In Naples, of course, where he played.
Involved in his life, and that meant an exposure to drugs, women, financial impropriety, all sorts of things that were going on, and he was sort of at their behest. So it can be a very complicated existence. I think it becomes increasingly hard when you're that famous and you're that loved by millions of people around the world, and you're that well rewarded for what you do, to retain a kind of a sensible life. I mean, you look at Ronaldo at the White House, and it is a peculiarity. I mean, it shouldn't necessarily be something that makes a lot of sense. And here we are.
And yet, I mean, the Maradona example, as you say, grew up as a semi-homeless character in Argentina, and then became the world's greatest soccer star. His career blew up originally in Barcelona, and then he made his name in Naples. So it's not surprising. But one of the characters you cover in the book, I know, is Michel Platini, the great French midfield player, whose life was also marked by controversy. Platini was, seems to me at least, you know much more about it than me, both remarkably intelligent on and off the pitch. So you can be intelligent off the pitch and still get into trouble after you hang your boots up.
True, but I guess that's the same in any walk of life. Where there is, particularly where there's a lot of money and a lot of power, there can be a lot of problems. So for someone like Platini, and indeed FIFA as an institution, which he was heavily involved with, where they are running the game and running this billion-pound international institution, it's been dogged by controversy and corruption, whiffs of corruption, for many, many years under many different leaderships. It's difficult when we think about the recent World Cups being in Russia and Qatar. This was a big, big change from where the World Cup traditionally had its bases. In more conventional hotbeds of the sport in Europe, in South America, and all of a sudden, we began to extend. The USA hosted the World Cup in 1994, and then it went over to Asia and Japan and South Korea and to South Africa. But it was really difficult. I remember to this day when they pulled out the pieces of paper and said that 2018 was going to be Russia, and Qatar was coming next in 2022. Just being staggered, because it didn't make sense, and it just made you ask questions about the people making these decisions.
And Platini was one of the characters involved in this, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he was subsequently cleared. It's difficult to assess sometimes the realities of these situations, but it was certainly a big stain on his reputation, and it was something that, when he became involved in football politics, it was considered to be a real breakthrough and a great refreshing moment to have a phenomenal footballer who had that direct knowledge of what it is to be one of the great players of your generation, or indeed any generation, to know exactly how it is to be a footballer and live that life, to then have someone like that in a position of power in the game's governance. There was a lot of hope, positivity about that. But I think the environment, there was such a stench around the administration of football that I don't know, it would be hard for one person to be able to clean that up very quickly.
I was actually surprised that Platini was included, not because of his tarnished reputation after he hung up his boots in the Soccer 100. How good a player was he? I'm guessing he's certainly not a top 50 all-time player, is he?
That's up to interpretation.
Well, your view. I mean, you wrote about him. I assume, did
Yeah.
you champion him, or did you get given the responsibility to write about him, or both?
Yeah, I think the way that it worked was that the list was put together by, they asked, I think it was 10 of us, of the most experienced football journalists and observers on the staff, to compile these lists of 100, which in itself is a pretty crazy task. And I think I just looked up before coming on how many professional footballers there are. Estimate is I think not far off 130,000 currently. So we extrapolate that over 150 years of football, albeit there's more now than there used to be because of the professionalism in the game has grown. That's a lot of players. And it's such a subjective thing. So I don't think there was ever any pretense that this was some kind of definitive list of an objective. You know, how can you judge sometimes one against the other from different generations, different positions on the pitch and so on. But I think there was a recognition of the impact that players had in their time. And Platini, at the time when he played, was iconic in Serie A, which in Italy, which was probably the top league. Really,
he played for Juventus.
He was the kingpin of that Juventus team. He was also the kingpin for the French team, which won trophies for the first time as an important football nation. He played with a certain elan, a certain grace that marked him out. He was particularly, we talk about that word, intelligent. He was a very, very intelligent player. He used to ghost around the pitch and appear where you didn't expect him, and had a fantastic technical ability that elevated him in great teams. So I think he, as a player, he certainly had his champions to be included in any big list.
One of the other players that you covered for the book was Zinedine Zidane, another French midfield player, hard man rather than a playmaker. But of course, Zidane won the World Cup, whereas Platini didn't. He's famously, I think, associated with failures on the French national team. How impactful was that in terms of determining the Soccer 100? I mean, Maradona, of course, Pele, and we'll talk about, won the World Cup 3 times. Maradona famously won the World Cup. Can one, or should one, in terms of evaluating careers, think about what they achieve within a team? Because in contrast with golf or soccer, in contrast with golf or tennis, soccer, football is a team sport.
That's a brilliant question. And I suppose in some ways it's those individuals within the team framework who lift the game, are difference makers. They're the ones that capture your imagination the most. And there's a lot of people in this list who played in great teams and won prizes, but because they, as individuals, shone that extra brightly, they become standout sort of poster boys, if you like, for their teams or their successes. And Zidane, for me, I always felt that one of the biggest issues with something like this is how you judge a player that you've seen in the flesh, in the stadium with your own eyes, versus particularly older players who you might have only seen on grainy clips. And it's really difficult to make that decision when you're being asked who is better than whom in that regard. And in my football watching life, which dates back 40 odd years now, I always feel that the player I most enjoyed watching in the stadium with my own eyes was Zidane. And I think he had an exceptional kind of charisma in the way that he played football. There was something very magnetic. I found myself often just watching him. He was a big, strong man, as you say, powerful, almost ungainly, but had this incredible balletic elegance. He sort of danced with the football. He had a relationship with it that I thought was really poetic and unusual. And he would make very original moves. And certainly as far as winning World Cups is something that gives you that extra clout in terms of, how good are you.
Speaking of clout, of course, he'll probably be most famously remembered by historians for his famous headbutt.
I don't know about most famously. I think that there is a sort of strange bookending of his career, certainly with France, that he was the man who won the World Cup for them with 2 goals in the final in 1998. In fact, I was there at the Arc de Triomphe when his face was beamed onto it, and the entire, that millions of people were there singing Zizou President. They wanted him to be the president as such. He seemed to be the golden boy of an entire nation. And the other end of that was his last moment on a football pitch, was crashing his head like a bull into the chest of an opponent, Marco Materazzi, who
in the following World Cup final
provoked him in 2006. It was a few years after, and he, that was his last ever game. That was supposed to be the curtain call and the great farewell, and it ended with a drama none of us quite expected. So very, very memorable. But I think it also shows, for me as a lover of the game, and a student of the game, that we idolize these people for what they can do, but they show their human side with their weaknesses sometimes, and I'm not altogether sure that's a bad thing.
No, I think it's a good thing, and I mean Maradona is obviously the best example, but the famous Zidane headbutt, I think, actually adds to his reputation. I don't want to turn this into a gendered conversation, Amy. I'm sure you get sick of people asking you why, as a woman, you've spent your life dedicated to a male sport. But in terms of sensibility, you mentioned that Zidane had a poetic quality, perhaps the Nijinsky, if you like, of the sport. Do you think that women bring a different kind of sensibility? I mean, you're one of the pioneering female journalists. There are more of them now, but when you began, you were one of the first.
That's true. When you say a different sensibility, do you mean, I presume you mean as an observer rather than as a player? Because obviously women do play football.
Yeah, and as an observer, as a writer, as somebody who contributed to the Soccer 100. I mean, how many other women were involved in determining the Soccer 100?
I think it might just have been me.
Wow.
But not that many women have been doing it quite as long.
Did you ever play the women's card when you were arguing for one player or another and say, well, actually, as a woman, I really think...
No, I did not. I have never done that. I have always wanted to just be the best judge I can, irrespective of gender. I don't think it affects how I read the game or how I feel the game. I did used to sometimes think that the one advantage, if anything, was if you're in a room full of journalists, you're maybe just a bit more memorable because there's only one of you or a couple of you compared to a sea of men. And I also felt, when particularly given the opportunity to do one-on-one interview, if you would get a time to sit and talk to someone, that maybe having a slightly more sensitive line of questioning, but I don't know whether that's a personality thing or a gender thing, sometimes allowed people to relax a little bit more than thinking they had to be a bit more careful talking to another man. And I don't know whether some of the macho vibes would be part of that. It was difficult to guess, but I was always pretty confident in trying to respect whoever I spoke to in the game, with speaking with knowledge and enthusiasm, and hoping that that was sufficient to get the respect that I felt would be nice to get in return.
I know you went to your first game when you were 6 years old, up the road, a certain part of North London. Why, Amy? Why have you dedicated your life to this game?
I'd say it felt a little bit like a love affair from a young age. I just, something about the whole temperament and atmosphere around football just grabbed me from the very first time I went. And I think as I grew up into being a teenager in the sort of 80s, when football was a bit of a more dangerous environment than it is now, certainly in England, there was hooliganism was a massive problem, and it was not considered a particularly safe place to be. something about the kind of raw energy that I felt there appealed to maybe my rebel heart. And while some of my mates were off going shopping for lipsticks or whatever, that just didn't interest me at all. I felt I had my calling to be in this slightly edgy, sporting, unpredictable, dramatic environment, and I just loved it. I felt at home there from as far back as I can remember, and I think being a bit of a nerd as well, I used to love studying all the details and the stats, and there weren't that many people that were doing that at that time, and it just became my thing, and that was it. I've been once I got to work in it, I've been there ever since.
You mentioned that you saw Zidane play, and he was magnetic in person. Who didn't you see in the list? If there was one, I'm not asking you for the greatest player in your view or in the history of the game, but if there's someone you wished you'd seen, who was it in person?
100% Maradona.
Why?
Because.
But peak Maradona, not fat Maradona.
Peak Maradona had he played with a madness. I think there was something of the kind of intense creative artist about him, in his character, in his spirit, in the way that he played. I'm not sure there's been many, if any, who have played as he did ever. He was a street footballer. His technique came from, playing in a way that today's cosseted stars would not recognize, with their neat kind of astros and their clean boots and what have you. He had a kind of, the ball almost became an extension of his crazy imagination, and it was so compelling to watch. And he also played in a time where people would very aggressively fight you to stop you playing. It was a more cynical game then, especially when he was playing in Italy, which was the best league in the world. You watch videos now and see how he was hacked and kicked and wrestled and pinched. And because people couldn't stop him by playing football, they had to find another way to try and stop him. And he was this low center of gravity sort of bundle of incredible power and muscle and energy.
Yeah, and Brian Butler famously said in probably the greatest goal ever scored, is an 86 goal against England in the quarterfinal, described him as a little eel.
Yes, exactly. You can imagine that you just couldn't quite grasp him, no matter how good.
You can't catch eels. And of course, Amy, if you were going to watch him, it would have to be that game, the quarterfinal against England, wouldn't it? The hand of God, and then the remarkable goal. And that tournament, the World Cup, there's never been a World Cup, even if you include Pele, which was so dominated by a single individual.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the closest was Baggio when it was USA 94, who nearly got Italy there. And then, again, in this sort of, it's why we love sport, you get these dramatic human moments. It was him.
Is Baggio on the list, by the way?
In the final, sorry?
Is Baggio on the list?
Is Baggio on the list? That is a good question.
I went to some of those games. He certainly should get on just for his hair, I think.
Baggio was a marvel player I loved as well. But yeah, so I think it's undeniable that Maradona almost, this is why he's so special and so high in any list, that in the team sport, he almost single-handedly carried a team of good players, but not as great as him, to win a World Cup, and also for a team like Napoli, which was a relatively minor team in Italy at the time, to win the league twice, it was a kind of a miracle, and it's why he's still deified there. And you still go to Naples and see murals, supersized, reveling in Maradona, and it will always be thus.
World Cups are so important. Another of the greatest players, clearly in history, is Alfredo Di Stefano, the Argentine. I don't know what you call him, an inside forward, played for the great Real Madrid side, but he never really, I don't think he ever even played in a World Cup. How essential do you think performing on the world stage at the World Cup is for evaluating the Soccer 100? I mean, Di Stefano is clearly on the list, but do you think if he'd have maybe done what Maradona did in 86 or what Pele did in 62, we might think differently about him.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. He might be higher up on the list than he is. He's still in a pretty decent position. But it's
Where
really,
is he on the list? Did you have a formal list, by the way?
I do have a list. If you just bear with me one sec. Di Stefano is number 6, so he's just outside the top 5.
And so what? Pele, Maradona, Messi.
Yeah, Messi is number 1. Maradona number 2, Pele 3, Cruyff number 4, and Cristiano Ronaldo number 5, as voted by this company.
Oh dear.
It's not necessarily my top 5 in that order. In fact, not all of them were in my top 5. But
I would certainly wouldn't put Ronaldo in just because he went to the White House. But that's another issue.
Yeah, you get points deducted for that straight away.
But the fact that Di Stefano got in number 6, when most people, unless you're interested in the history of the game or you live in Madrid, you wouldn't know much about the guy.
Well, that's the beauty of this history, which is that, you know, essentially we've had to try and assess people that, you know, we haven't got the benefits of seeing. You know, it's so different nowadays when you imagine Messi or Ronaldo's entire careers have been televised. So you can be in any continent anywhere in the world over the last 20 years, and you probably would have had access to just about everything they've ever done. Whereas, you know, the television aspect was so minuscule then that perhaps the only time you would see these great players, if you didn't live in that country, so if you were outside of Spain and Madrid, your only access to a player like that was at a European or a cup, a World Cup, or in European Champions League as we know it now, where he was very dominant. So it's hard. It's not quite like for like. And even the amount, you know, when you look at records or you look at data, or how many goals somebody scored, how many appearances they made, you know, a Puskas or Eusebio or Di Stefano or whatever, never got able to pick up goals playing against Lithuania or Andorra, or, you know, there were not so many matches against so many smaller nations where records are more prominent among more recent players than they are amongst the older players.
Yeah, and Di Stefano's own personal history was interesting. He almost went to Barcelona and Real Madrid stole him. So the whole history of not just the narrative of Di Stefano, but Spanish football history might have been quite different.
Yeah, who can imagine? We had a bit more recently when Luis Figo went from Barcelona to Real Madrid. It just shows about the history of that particular relationship in that football country. And it's a very famous incident when a pig's head was thrown onto the pitch where Figo was taking a penalty because he'd crossed the divide. He'd done the unthinkable. He was the Judas of all time for Barcelona fans when he went off to Madrid. You know, there's a lot of feeling wrapped up in.
Yeah, well, the word Judas is often used also in North London about a certain unnameable player. Let's get to Messi, Amy. I mean, he's number 1 on the list. He's clearly a remarkable player. How would you evaluate him in world historic terms? Did you vote for him to be number 1? Is he really above Pele, for example?
Well, I didn't, but I think I was in the minority. I think there was a lot of personal preferences really in the top 3 of Messi, Maradona, and Pele. In a way, Messi has redefined modern football. Messi and Ronaldo have, you know, in this kind of collective way, in a way, but they're so different. You know, Ronaldo is sort of like built by design, and is a guy who's always
a machine. I mean, if AI could create a footballer, it would be Ronaldo, wouldn't it?
Exactly, and to an extent, there's always been a sort of like more of an individualism about him. It's sort of about him. Whereas Messi, as a sort of quite shy young man, has always been there to serve the team. He's not really someone for personal glory. So there's a big contrast there in their personalities. And I think that even shows in how they play the game. But Messi, you know, there've just been countless examples over the last 15, 20 years where you know, it's breathtaking. You've absolutely just gasped in awe of what this man is capable of doing. his dribbling skills in the modern age where there's a lot more functional football, his capacity to find shots that you don't think are possible. I think he's, without question, for me, the greatest modern player. You know, whether you want to choose him above Maradona or Pelé is the argument of history against contemporary.
Yeah, and of course, it's probably no coincidence that Maradona, Messi, and Di Stefano are all from Argentina, small country, or relatively small country in Latin America, where, I mean, everyone always makes the cliche about football being a religion, but in Argentina, when you visit, it really is a religion, isn't it, Amy?
It is, but that same thing goes for across a lot of Latin countries, and certainly a lot of Latin America. You know, I was in Brazil at the World Cup that they hosted in 2016, and Argentina made it to the final. They didn't win that one, but and Brazil were in the semis, and I remember seeing Brazil got beaten 7-1 in the semi-finals by Germany. It was one of the most
famous,
devastating ever. And the Argentinians were wondering about the Copacabana. They didn't have enough fingers to take the Mickey out of their Brazilian hosts at that time. But there was so much emotional fire between those two countries, and they have such obsessiveness about their football. It is deeply, deeply ingrained in their culture. Just quickly on the subject of Argentina and the Messi-Maradona debate, the current coach of the US national team, Mauricio Pochettino, wrote the foreword for the Soccer 100 book. And in his view, he said, you know, they're both my number ones, but if I have to choose, I'll go for Maradona. So I'm kind of inclined to.
Well, he played, didn't he?
Refer to him. He did play with. He played with him. Yeah, so he played with Maradona, which is a blessing.
Very different. Pochettino's a rather different sort of player from either Maradona or Messi. Although neither of them have his perhaps intelligence or managerial qualities. Let's talk about Pelé, Amy. When I was growing up, he was clearly number one. This was pre-Maradona, pre-Messi. He played his whole career in Brazil, played for Santos, never played in the European Cup, in contrast with Di Stefano. Most people knew him as a player who was famous through the World Cup. I remember my father watching him and being utterly amazed. How great a player was Pelé? And can one compare him, say, to Messi, who played so many games for Barcelona in the Spanish league, very competitive league, in the European Cup, whereas Pelé really just played for Santos and Brazil?
Yes, but Pelé was the king. You know, Pelé was probably the first global megastar of football, and it makes it even more remarkable to think that he achieved that when he didn't play outside of his. He played a little bit in the MLS, I think, towards the very end of his career, but you know, broadly, he didn't make that move to Europe. But in those days, you know, the world was not so globalized, so there was much less cross-fertilization in general. It wasn't a given if you were growing up in Brazil or Argentina or any Africa or anywhere that it was destination Europe is the goal. Nowadays, that's something that's pumped into the minds of every young player anywhere in the world, that they must somehow get themselves to Europe. But Pelé, because he came so young onto the scene, because, you know, he was 17 when he was playing in World Cups and starring, and just an immense, immense talent that couldn't be stopped. And obviously people gravitate towards goal scorers. He was a goal scorer. He could score every kind of goal imaginable. He could elude players. He was, he had this presence. He had this aura when he played football. And he was just a star immediately in a non-globalized, non-internet world. And I think, as you yourself say, and it comes from your dad, and I feel the same, which is that when you speak, you know, I grew up, when you spoke to people who were older than you, there wasn't a debate. Pelé was the best. Like, I'd never even really heard anyone contend that in my childhood. I don't know if you did, but it just felt like that was the law. That was the way of the world. And I kind of deferred to that when I did my own vote, and that's why I voted for Pelé as number one.
Remarkable career, which of course you don't always have Hollywood endings with football careers. I guess Messi had one. Maradona had the opposite, in that the longer his career went, the more absurd and tragic it became. But with Pelé, you had the 1970 World Cup, where he may not have been quite as good a footballer, but in a way he was even more remarkable. Is that fair? The World Cup in which Brazil won the final 4-1 against Italy in Mexico City, scored the fourth goal, many people believe, along with Maradona's goal against England being the finest goal ever scored, and which Pelé played a role. I think, didn't he give the final pass to the fullback?
Yes, Josimar. Was it? El Jairzinho. I can't even remember.
No, it wasn't Jairzinho. It was Carlos Alberto.
Carlos Alberto. Good God, I should remember that. I think because he already had that status, there's already so much attention on you. But it was more than that. It was, I think that 1970 World Cup was where it created a myth that everybody who loved football chose Brazil as their second team, if they were from anywhere else in the world, because of they had an aesthetic beauty about the way they played, a joyousness about the way they played that was completely infectious. And Pelé was absolutely central to that.
Sorry, Amy. And yet, for all the nobility and the glamour of Pelé, Brazilian football also had its own tragedies. I remember seeing grainy video of their winger Garrincha destroying England in the 1962 World Cup. But he also had a tragic history. Tell me a little bit about Garrincha and how you would rate him, where he came on the list. He's certainly top 20, isn't he?
Super close. Let me see what he is on the list. He's 14, which is...
I mean, that game against England, was it in the 62 World Cup, where every time he got the ball, he beat about 4 men. It was remarkable. And half the time he was just dribbling for fun.
Well, I think it's the art of the dribble that, people find so elusive and wonderful to watch. And he was the master. And he had those bandy legs. I think there's a story that his legs were not the same size and a bit misformed. And he had a lot of trouble with them. But it gave him this... weird kind of movement and balance that made him unstoppable. And that Brazil team was packed full of very, very unique, original talents, and they were very expressive on a football pitch. And not all teams were able to play like that. And of course, you have to remember that in those kind of times, in the 60s and 70s, the only time that people saw football on telly was on these World Cups, and so they were huge events. There was no other. There was virtually nothing on telly anyway. What did you have? A couple of channels maybe. So it was so rare and it was so special. And you can imagine the whole world virtually who had access to TV watching the same thing.
Although I think in 62, I'm not even sure how much it was on TV.
Yeah,
I mean, in 66, of course, Pelé got kicked off the pitch in England. 70 was probably really the beginning of the television age, maybe 66. Of course, there's also the Hungarian, Ferenc Puskás, another remarkable footballer who was well known on the world stage, who destroyed England. How would you analyze him? He looked anything but an athlete, a little fat Hungarian, the galloping major.
Exactly. I was just seeing one of those pictures on that it came up on the screen, the black and white one, where he's definitely got a bit of a tummy going on.
To put it mildly, that was when he was a manager, I think.
Yes. But
I hope, anyway.
Again, it was the legend. I just remember as a child, reading books and learning about these people and the way that they were described. You knew that they were game changers. Puskás and that Hungarian team changed football back in the 50s.
Yeah, I mean, they came, in 1953? They beat England 6-3 at home in England, which everyone thought the English were the best for some reason.
Indeed, yeah, but it's mythology, isn't it? It's the stuff of legend.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about journalists, because anyone growing up in England will be famous with Geoffrey Green's description of the way in which Ferenc Puskás destroyed the English team. I think there's one famous description in which he describes one of the English defenders being beaten as if he'd been, I think, missing a bus or something like that. How important do you think journalists are? I mean, I grew up with Glanville and Geoffrey Green, always my heroes. Did you grow up with football journalists as heroes, and how important are they? I mean, I mentioned, we got some very good ones these days. You're a very good one. Barney Ronay, he's not really a journalist, but certainly a football commentator. I enjoy his work in The Guardian. How important do you think journalists are in the way in which we think about football greatness?
Less so now, for sure, because people can make their own judgments and they see a lot more than they did. I think, growing up at a time when you were reliant on someone else's eyes and someone else's assessments. So reading what the great and the good had to say and the descriptive ways that they could do so was a key to trying to understand and appreciate what was going on in football, because you couldn't see it all yourself. So I think I think there was much more clout from the likes of a Glanville or Geoffrey Green or Hugh McIlvanney, or the great writers who dominated in helping us understand the game. And nowadays, I think there's much more focus on TV commentators. They're the ones that set the agenda. The soundbite sets the agenda, sometimes, often wrongly, which is frustrating. The clicks and the things that are going to get people to bite and have a reaction become more influential than the really well thought out assessments, which I think is a bit of a pity, but that's the way of the world. That's where we live now. I'd like to think there's still room for great writing, because
Who's your favorite journalist, football journalist
now?
Yeah,
I really like Jonathan Liew from The Guardian. An old colleague of mine. I think he's a very, very original writer who has his own mind and his own thoughts and writes beautifully.
One thing I disagree with you. You mentioned that Baggio competed with Maradona for dominating the World Cup, but the one person we haven't talked about, who's probably on this stage at least, my greatest hero, who I once met in a restaurant in Amsterdam, is Johan Cruyff. He dominated the 1974 World Cup as much, perhaps in some ways, almost as Maradona. He was a man both remarkably intelligent on and off the pitch. What do you make of Cruyff?
Cruyff was a marvel. Cruyff, I think you're right about the thinking. Cruyff encouraged everybody to think instead of just watch. He challenged what everybody thought. He had a phenomenal way with words. He was extremely articulate, and he could put into words things that you would see and make them make a whole different sort of sense. And he was an original, in terms of the way that he comprehended sport, as well as being a brilliant, brilliant footballer. I mean, look, he's got a skill named after him. He was imaginative. But he was a bit of a rebel as well. He did what he felt was right.
Yeah, I mean, he's the anti-Ronaldo, isn't he? I mean, he blew up his career in a way, decided not to go to the 78 World Cup. I think it's because his wife didn't trust him with the ladies, perhaps, which might have resulted in Sorry?
I said it's unimaginable to just not go to a World Cup, because...
Yeah, especially when you were... I mean, he might not have been quite as good in 78 as he was in 74, but he's still a pretty good player.
He was a great manager as well. He was a
man of the left. I mean, Ronaldo's clearly, I don't know if he's Trumpian, but he has that kind of self-interested quality. Is Cruyff... I mean, football is supposed to be the game of the people. It increasingly is less and less the game of the people. It was the game, certainly, of the English working class and of the working classes of Latin America. Should one credit Cruyff's politics? I mean, certainly Pelé I mean, Maradona, Messi, they're not really very political characters, but Cruyff was, and should we commend him for that, given that it's supposed to be the game of the people, the game of the working class?
I think that's a beautiful sentiment, and I think he'd like it.
Well, unfortunately, he's no longer around. I'm going to allow you one other player. I'm absolutely determined you're not allowed to talk about Henry or Vieira, but I will allow you to talk about Bergkamp, the third Arsenal player on the list. You're famously associated with that club. And I'm not going to ask you about Jimmy Greaves. I'll save that for other interviews. Talk to me about Bergkamp. You watched him as a remarkably balletic player. We're very famous for a remarkable goal in the World Cup. He refused to get on planes, which is always an astonishing statistic. Is Bergkamp, Femi, your all-time favourite Arsenal player?
That's all. He's very much in the conversation. I do fluctuate from time to time, but I think in terms of the impact that he had and the way that he played the game, it's hard to look much beyond him. I was fortunate enough to spend some time with him at various points talking to him, and I used to love talking to him because, again, I mean, this word original keeps coming up, and maybe it's a Dutch thing, and it's, you know, he was first given his first appearance under Johan Cruyff and came through under that manager at Ajax. There is that sort of Dutch way of thinking and speaking and being that, you know, they have a certain directness. Excuse me. Someone's come home from school. Apologies.
Dennis Bergkamp.
But I always used to think when you was talking to him that you could see his brain ticking away behind his head. And he spoke quite slowly. He used to really think about what he was saying and what his words were. But what I loved about him is once went to his apartment in Amsterdam where he grew up. And he was sort of self-taught as a sort of skillsman, as a technician. And he used to go outside his apartment block as a boy and with a ball and play sort of, you know, kicking the ball against the wall, as millions of kids do all over the world. But the way he did it was by a sort of almost scientific experiment. And he would say, right, I'm going to kick the ball against that corner of that brick, and I'm going to do it with my instep, with the outside of my foot, with my laces, and then I'm going to do this corner, and I'm going to do. And he analysed exactly how the ball moved, with all these minute little changes, to sort of develop his technical understanding of space and everything around it. He was the king of the first touch. That was his favourite thing, was a great first touch and how that buys you that millisecond. For me, he's one of the great players that I've ever seen. And that goal in the World Cup in '98.
Yeah, I mean, the goal, who was it against?
It was against Argentina. It was in the very, very last dying embers of that game. It was a very hot day in Marseille. I was there in the stadium. And when he scored that goal, he just fell to the floor and covered his face with his hands. And I always felt like he was just having a moment to just save it for himself before it became sort of the property of the world, this great goal, which is still talked about to this day.
Well, there you have it. The Soccer 100 with Amy Lawrence. Amy, you looking forward to the World Cup? Upcoming, are you going to, I assume you'll be, I mean, you work for The Athletic, even if you're based in North London, which is The Athletic's owned by the New York Times. Any particular concerns or excitement about the upcoming World Cup?
I'm maybe a bit more concerned than I would have been about coming to America, just because of some of the things that feel a little less appealing, shall we say?
Yeah, I've heard rumours that they don't allow Arsenal fans now into the country.
Yeah, I'm pretty much expecting to be grilled on arrival. But I'm hopeful that it's, you know, but there's always a lot of scaremongering for World Cups, that things are going to be complicated and difficult and problematic. And ultimately, once the tournament starts, the football and the...
Do we have to, finally, do we always have to be just careful about nostalgia? I mean, I grew up, the first World Cup I saw was in '66. 70, 74, 78. I can tell you stories. And in fact, we've got Simon Cooper on the show. He has a new book out about the personal history of the World Cup. Do we all have a tendency, because it's a game that we fall in love with as kids, to always imagine that it was better in the past?
Yes, I'd say so. My favourite was my first. So
Which was that?
well, the first I went to Italia 90 as a student with around about $200 and a sleeping bag, and it was a sort of seminal life experience. So that's a personal favourite, even though it's quite a criticised World Cup. It wasn't considered to be one of the best for the quality of
Although the English did pretty well, right?
Yeah, but I was following the game rather than the England national team. So,
were you in Naples for the Italy-Argentina?
No, but that would have been wild. I can only imagine.
Well, Amy Lawrence, real honor to have you on the show, one of the contributors to the Soccer 100 celebration of the greatest players in the sport's history. It's out, published by The Athletic. Amy, good luck with everything.